So 6:15 hours in late August 1944, observation post for Pardal, France. As German technical officers of Flak Regiment 155W strained to understand the equations in front of them, the morning report was crumpled on the desk. Every ballistic probability premise taught at Luftwaffe Technikalmies around the Reich was broken by the interception rates. 82% were destroyed. This isn't true. German observers, using field telescopes, had seen something that defied the assurances of their intelligence services regarding the anti-aircraft capabilities of the Allies. The destruction rate of the V-1 flying bombs, which had been fired against London in the pre-dawn hours, was inexplicable. Not destroyed by combatants executing risky pursuit curves. Over the coastal gun belt, they were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire rather than entangled in barrage balloon cables. Instead of needing direct impacts, the shells somehow detonated close to the missiles, bursting with unfathomable accuracy. Throughout the German V-1 campaign, Oberst Max Vittel, commander of the entire V-1 offensive, received these reports with increasing worry at the headquarters of Flak Regiment 155W in the Chateau d'Otto. By late August, the coastal gun belt had destroyed 74% of flying bombs, up from 17% in June. On one particularly notable day in that last week of August 1944, the percentage reached 82%, signaling the start of the most significant technological shock the Wehrmacht's weapons scientists would encounter during the war. Vittel and no other German scientist realized they were watching the deployment of one of the most closely kept secrets of World War II, a technology so groundbreaking that it was given the same level of protection as the development of the atomic bomb. Hitler's terror weapon was being methodically destroyed by the proximity fuse, or VT, variable time fuse, as the Allies coded it, with an accuracy that German physics claimed shouldn't be possible. The story started precisely 1 week after D-Day, on June 13, 1944, 10 weeks prior. Hitler had fired his long-promised Veril Tungswehr vengeance weapon at London in reaction to the Allied invasion of Normandy. 4:25 a.m. A railway bridge and surrounding residences were destroyed when the first V-1 struck London on June 13th, landing at Grove Road in Bow. There were 200 homeless individuals, 30 injuries, and 6 fatalities. The weapon, a pilotless aircraft with an Argus 109-014 pulse-jet engine that could carry 850 kg of A-metal explosive at 640 km/h, was the culmination of years of German study. The German High Command thought it would bring Britain to its knees because it was the first operational cruise missile in history. Even with a realistic 25% success rate, the V-1 would bring more explosive power to London than the entire Blitz of 1940-41, according to Major Walter Dornberger, chief of VW's weapons department at Peenemünde. Production of each V-1 cost about 5,000 Reichsmarks, which is a small portion of the price of a manned bomber flight that poses no risk to the aircrew. German scientists at the Peenemünde Army Research Center had good cause to be optimistic. In addition to producing functional jet aircraft and cutting-edge rocket technology, they have now deployed the first cruise missile. The control system for the V-1 was created by Dr. Robert Lasser, who estimated that Allied interception was almost impossible. The flying bomb flew between 600 and 2,700 meters at a speed of 640 kilometers per hour. It took British fighters more than 650 km/h to intercept. They had to risk devastation from the explosion by closing within 200 meters in order to destroy it. Regarding anti-aircraft fire, it was estimated that less than 1 in 10,000 shells fired would directly strike such a small, swift target. This was good ballistic science, not hype. Traditional time-fuse shells needed precision timing, manual fuse setting, exact calculation, and accurate prediction. Gunners had maybe 30 seconds from detection to engagement at the V-1 pace. As the commander of Flak Regiment 155W, our Max Vachtal was aware of these restrictions from both sides of the anti-aircraft conflict. The Germans launched 9,521 V-1 missiles from ground positions against England during the battle, and thousands more against other targets, for a total of about 25,000 V-1s used during the war. German intelligence received alarming reports within days of the initial launches. The speed at which British anti-aircraft systems were evolving was dubious. The interception rate increased from 10% to 24% by the end of June, which was more than expected but understandable. The data became unfathomable when July arrived. German technical officers keeping an eye on efficacy observed British weapons claiming V-1 kills with incredibly cheap ammunition costs. On the French coast, observers saw V-1s flying steadily in the direction of England, encircled by bursts of flak, and then plummeting out of the sky, even though the explosions were too distant to kill them directly. German intelligence was unaware that they were seeing proximity fuses that converted close calls into fatalities. Since the USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber in January 1943, using shells that detonated when they sensed their closeness to targets, the technology had been in use in the Pacific. The failure of German intelligence was all-encompassing. Proximity fuse research was included in the November 1939 Oslo report, but German experts rejected it as misinformation. Similar technology had been attempted to be developed by Germany. None of the more than 30 designs that were investigated became operational. German engineers came to the conclusion that proximity fuses couldn't work, miniaturizing radio transmitter receivers for artillery shells, ensuring vacuum tubes could withstand 20,000 G-forces, developing batteries that could activate after years of storage, and reaching mass production were all seemingly insurmountable technical obstacles. However, American companies were manufacturing 40,000 VT fuses every day by August 1944. The proximity fuse was at its most effective in the latter week of August 1944. The whole British anti-aircraft defense system had been overhauled. American STR-584 radar was used by guns to track automatically. More importantly, they launched shells that had VT fuses that were specially adjusted for V-1 threats. A concentrated gun belt was formed by the redeployment of the Royal Artillery and RAF unit from their North Downs positions to the south coast. By ensuring that any dud shells went into the sea, this coastal posture helped to avoid German capture. V-1s entered a death zone where technology outweighed statistics as they approached the English shoreline. The SCR-584 radar determined trajectories, fed firing solutions to weapons, and automatically latched onto targets. Small radio transmitters constructed using tubes created by Sylvania Electric and Western Electric were housed in the proximity fuse. Steel pieces were sent through V-1 hulls by detonators activated by Theratron switches when reflected signals signaled proximity. Coastal guns destroyed 82% of incoming V-1s on the busiest day in late August, a figure that German engineers considered physically unachievable. German headquarters had crisis talks as reports of 82% interception surfaced. WTL thought it might be sabotage. Emergency missile checks revealed no issues. Performance in test firings over German territory was typical. The issue only appeared in opposition to British defenses. German specialists came to the conclusion that the British had created groundbreaking anti-aircraft systems, but they were unable to pinpoint the details without capturing specimens. They experimented with alternative strategies, altitudes, bigger salvos, night launches, and weather manipulation. Nothing was successful. The death rate was still horrifying. Scientists at Peenemünde had to face an unsettling conclusion. The Allies had accomplished what Germany believed was impossible if they had created proximity fuses. German attempts to learn the secret grew more intense, but ultimately failed. The security of the proximity fuses was almost flawless. 110 factories were used to separate production. Employees were solely aware of their assigned jobs. The term variable time was purposefully deceptive, implying a traditional timed fuse instead of proximity sensors. By 1944, fuse production had taken up all of the electronics industry's capacity in the United States. By the end of the war, 22 million proximity fuses, which had cost more than $1 billion in the 1940s, would be created. More than 5 million fuses were made by the Crossley Corporation alone, accounting for about 25% of the total production. It showed a startling industrial mismatch. America revolutionized its electronics industry to produce fuses, whereas Germany struggled to produce V-1s using slave labor. Production peaked at 40,000 units per day. By 1945, prices had fallen from $730 per unit in 1942 to $18. At its height, The 10,000-person Crossley Corporation, which had previously produced radios and refrigerators, was making 16,000 fuses every day. Developing ruggedized components was the focus of Sylvania Electric's whole vacuum tube research division, which produces 400,000 tiny tubes per day. Use of 95% of all tubes. It was a stark contrast. Germany produced a small number of handcrafted firearms. America generated groundbreaking technologies in previously unheard-of quantities. The overall German V-1 production for the duration of the war was surpassed by the monthly production of American proximity fuses. The proximity fuse was an example of exceptional engineering. The gadget had to withstand temperature fluctuations, 20,000 green acceleration, 25,000 RPM spin, and gunfire. Based on the designs of hearing aids, Sylvania created tiny vacuum tubes that were strengthened to withstand these forces. When needed, batteries that had lain dormant for years suddenly sprung to life. There was a little radio within the fuse that was always sending out signals. Circuits set off explosion when reflections showed that huge things were nearby. This idea seemed straightforward, but it needed resolving issues that German engineers thought were insurmountable. Quality assurance was unheard of. Each fuse was tested several times. In fact, test weapons were used to discharge random samples. At large-scale, rejection rates of less than 2% showed impressive manufacturing precision. The V-1 onslaught was successfully stopped by September 1944. Only 2,515 of the 9,521 V-1s fired from ground locations against Britain made it to London, where they killed 6,184 civilians and injured 17,181. Even though they were unfortunate, these deaths only partially reflected German goals. The commanding officer of Anti-Aircraft Command, General Frederick Pyle, estimated that V-1 deaths would have been 4 to 5 times higher in the absence of proximity explosives. The proximity fuse prevented the destruction of London. Germany created the V-2 rocket, which flew too quickly to be intercepted, and switched to night launches. However, these last-ditch efforts failed to have a strategic influence. The V-1 turned out to be an expensive failure that used resources that were sorely required elsewhere. One of the biggest intelligence failures in history occurred when the Germans failed to detect proximity fuses. The Germans never understood what they were up against, even with vast networks and technical know-how. Throughout the conflict, the program was kept under wraps. Throughout the V-1 campaign, not a single unbroken proximity fuse ended up in German hands. Interestingly, German troops never identified the proximity fuses in an American ammunition dump they took during the Battle of the Bulge. They were oblivious to the facts in their own hands because they believed that such technologies were impossible. Interrogations following Germany's surrender showed that the Germans had no idea what proximity fuses were. Max Vachtel informed Allied officers that while they had a suspicion of better radar or quicker fuses, they had never thought about self-thinking shells. German experts were shocked to see captured American VT fusers. They were unable to understand circuits working after gunfire, batteries surviving acceleration, or tubes surviving acceleration. Their technology was thought to be 10 years behind that of the United States. Dr. Merle Tuveit, who oversaw the development of proximity fuses at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, later remarked that systematic cooperation between engineers, scientists, and manufacturing workers was essential to success, something that totalitarian organizations were unable to accomplish. The proximity fuse proved that factories and labs had just as much influence over the outcome of World War II as did actual combat zones. America concentrated on multiplicative technology that improved current weapons, whereas Germany sought exotic wonder weapons. Every anti-aircraft gun was 5 to 10 times more effective thanks to the proximity fuse. James Forrestal, the Navy Secretary, said, "The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater." Slave labor was a major component of the V-1 program. In underground facilities that produced V-1s, tens of thousands of detainees from concentration camps perished. In the meantime, American workers willingly put in more hours for higher pay, acknowledging the value of their work even though they were unsure of its precise output. More than 5,000 women produced specialized components in 12-hour shifts at the Sylvania factory in Ipswich. Only after the war did they learn that they had contributed to defending London against Hitler's terror weapons. The secret of the proximity fuse held. The effectiveness of the British anti-aircraft cruise ammunition was unknown. Their ammo was unique and subject to stringent accounting regulations. We tracked each proximity-fused shell fired at V-1s. Shells that were unexploded were promptly secured. German dud recovery was hindered by the presence of naval warships patrolling the canal. It cost lives to keep this secret. It was not until December 1944 that proximity-fused artillery became available to Allied ground forces. Because the technology was too secret to risk, thousands of soldiers lost their lives. However, it was justified to use them against V-1s. It was vital that London survived the assault. Although the V-1 program had little strategic influence, it cost Germany vital resources. Unleashing millions of Reichsmarks, about 25,000 V-1s in total, and taking resources away from fighter planes and anti-tank weapons that were sorely needed on dwindling fronts. The program's failure was given a moral dimension by its reliance on slave labor. Weapons created by human misery were defeated by the proximity fuse, a difference that was only fully realized after the conflict. The proximity fuse symbolized the evolution of warfare, triumph by manufacturing and engineering as opposed to dominance in personal weaponry. It demonstrated that industrial systems, not simply armed troops, competed in modern conflict. The proximity fuse saved London before it saved Pacific Fleet ships and made Japan's defeat possible. The Germans, who witnessed the demise of V-1, never understood why. In their scientific paradigm, the technology that defeated them was unthinkable. It was a huge change. Prior to proximity fuses, an average of 2,500 heavy anti-aircraft shells were needed to destroy a V-1. This decreased to 100 shells when proximity fuses were used. In just 10 weeks, the pistol belt's interception rate increased from 17% to 82%. This was accomplished by mass-producing cutting-edge technology on a scale that Germany could neither duplicate nor understand, not by bravery or training. In order to make 22 million fuses, America mobilized its entire electronics industry, hired over 80,000 workers, and spent over $1 billion. In September 1945, the proximity fuse was declassified. The announcement from the War Department started. Only the atomic bomb was more ineffective than this crucial weapon created during the conflict. The revelation gave both clarity and embarrassment to German experts who had been perplexed by V-1 failures. They had lost because of industrial capacity they never thought imaginable, not because of strategy or bravery. German astonishment was evident in post-war interviews. They had thought that V-1 was the peak of weaponry technology. It was upsetting to learn that mass-produced electronics that cost less than $20 each had overcome it. They had fallen to assembly lines rather than combatants. Radar altimeters, electronic warfare capabilities, and air defense systems are all products of proximity fuse technology. It continued to serve as a constant reminder of the blindness of war to Germany's erstwhile weapons scientists. The proximity fuse demonstrated that mass-producing high-quality technologies is more important in contemporary warfare than creating flawless weapons. Individual weapons manufactured by Germany were excellent. The United States created millions of effective weapons. The essence of warfare was irrevocably altered on that historic day in late August 1944, when 82% of German V-1s were destroyed by proximity fuses. The invisible technology that was beating the Germans was unknown to them when they launched their retribution weapons. To the best of their knowledge, they had created cutting-edge weapons, trained elite crews, made breakthroughs, and accomplished everything correctly. However, mass-produced electronics they couldn't have imagined defeated them. Through thousands of little explosions, each directed by technology that German science believed was impossible, the proximity fuse rescued London. It was the victory of mass manufacturing over created perfection, industrial democracy over dictatorial engineering, and basic answers over intricate wonder weapons. The Germans were defeated by an industrial force they couldn't match and a secret they couldn't imagine, and they never found out what hit their V-1s as they fell smoking from the sky. It wasn't until much later that the Germans realized how and why the proximity fuse had transformed Hitler's weapon of vengeance into London's salvation. America's greatest triumph ultimately occurred in factories, where millions of workers, many of them women who had no idea what they were doing, produced the tiny electrical devices that saved a city and forever changed the nature of combat rather than on battlefields. Any wonder weapon, no matter how clever, could be defeated by industrial capacity in a contemporary conflict, as demonstrated by the 82% interception rate attained in late August 1944. There was more to the proximity fuse than just a weapon. It was proof that democracy could defeat the forced genius of tyranny by enlisting the help of business and science. And the Germans never understood why they had already lost a war that their leaders said they were winning, as they saw their flawless weapons drop from the sky.